So first of all, Mr. Allan Cain, thank you very much for the opportunity to have the interview. To begin, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the involvement of DW in the land law process. How were you guys able to participate in this process? Did you sort of get your own foot in the door, or were you asked by a certain organization to come in? And what was the process like between the public servants and the private organizations?
Yeah, our work on the land law came out of work that we had done earlier around the peace process. Because the land law was the discussion around the land law started in the last days of the Civil War. In fact, the land reforms that eventually led up to the 2004 law. The discussion had started in 2001 when the war was coming to a close, basically. And at least for us, we had a sense that the land conflicts were one of the principal fuelers of the conflict, of the Civil War. I mean, one looks back, they were probably the fundamental cause of the Liberation War as well. I mean, the issue around the expropriation of Angolan's land by colonial settlers certainly was one of the main issues that led to the independence struggles, basically. But we had a sense that at the end of the Civil War, that this was an opportunity to actually resolve some of these long-standing land conflicts that were never really addressed by the Angolan independent government after independence in 2005. Basically, I think land issues were on the back burner because we didn't have stability in rural areas or urban areas, for that matter, for all of the years since independence. There were massive movements of populations, the pushing people off the land was a strategy that the opposition or that UNITA used as a way of destabilizing, making populations dependent on government, and the flux of populations to the cities migration was an instrument of war, basically, during the conflict years. So we felt that for consolidating peace, that the land issue, this was an opportunity to address this long outstanding land issue. One of the problems was that the first short period of peace after the ceasefire in 1991, there was also a raft of legislation that was published, including a land law, that was an opportunity to introduce land reform at that time, and I think could have contributed to the consolidation of peace back in '92, but the country went back to war because I think the failure to consolidate some of these issues, or to resolve some of these issues, and the 1991-92 so-called land reforms only consolidated the colonial cadastral distribution of land that had been done in colonial times, and basically weakened the land claims of or traditional land claims or land claims of peasants and families who had been pushed off their land in the colonial era or had been displaced during the conflict years, because the colonial cadastre was accepted as part of the 91 reforms. So they weren't really reforms from the point of view of communities or peasants. So anyway, so Development Workshop, along with a number of other civil society organizations, got involved when the government in 2002 called for consultation, national consultation around the draft land law. DW had been working on research on land issues back since the mid-90s, looking at we did a study on post-socialist land reform, looking at other post-socialist countries in the African region and in Latin America, looking at how some states had dealt with this issue of state-owned land and making it available for community or personal use. So this was an area that DW had been doing some prior work on. There was, I think, an important aspect of this is that there was some funding around from international donors to do some of this research. We had some funding from the British government through DFID. There was also a USAID project that we were involved with that provided some financing for research and advocacy work. And the NGOs that were, let's say the development NGOs rather than the humanitarian or relief NGOs, most of us came together under the banner of the Red Terre, the land network, in 2002. The idea of the Red Terre was to use the NGO networks who had been involved with humanitarian work during the conflict years and had a presence and had done work in different parts of the country to facilitate a debate and discussion around the draft land law and encourage local communities to prepare arguments, present their concerns to a government commission that had been set up to look at the land law. So I think one of the successes of the Red Terre is that initially this consultation period was to be 6 months, because there was such active engagement of civil society and local community organizations all across the country. That period of consultation got extended almost 2 years, and there were a number of national hearings at the level of Parliament and national working group that had been set up to look at the law. So there was, I think this was one of the few opportunities that civil society, on the invitation of government, had to actually be heard around an important piece of legislation. And as I said, for us, this was an important law in terms of for consolidating peace, but also in Development Workshop's work on human settlements regarding housing and both urban and rural settlements. The land law is fundamental. Our concern about the previous land law was that community and individual and peasant rights were not really taken into account. And the old pattern of land concessions based on colonial occupation was still, had been actually consolidated. So we were hoping that that was one of the things that could be broken down. Now, also the land reforms that Mozambique had put in place in their post-war period. The Mozambican land law, I believe, was published in 1997, and it was several years after the peace settlement in Mozambique that we had hoped there would be, experience that could, we could learn from, or Angola could learn from experience from Mozambique. And we organized a number of exchanges between key people who had been involved with the land law in Mozambique and Angola. And one of the things that we felt was a good practice that Mozambique had embedded in their land law was the right of occupation in good faith. Basically, this is a principle that grew out of the civil code that both Mozambique and Angola that used as a basis of their laws, and permitted really the acquisition of land tenure rights through occupation over a period of time. So this was something that the Mozambican land law embedded and articulated, the right of occupation in good faith. And this was one of the issues that civil society and certainly Development Workshop were actively defended. And this principle wasn't in the draft land law. We were very, very, well, this was one of the main points that we tried to argue. A number of the other civil society organizations in Angola who worked in rural areas, and particularly in the south of Angola, were concerned about customary rights as well. And customary rights were not articulated in the draft land law. So a number of anthropologists and agronomists in Angola, civil society organizations, made this one of the platforms of the civil society campaign. These were some of the key issues, basically. The other important issue was this one around cadastre and the fact that the settled lands of Angola, and particularly in the west of the country, had been mapped, and a cadastre individual of concessions had been plotted in colonial times. Much of the south and the far east of the country, the Portuguese cadastre had never reached those areas. But those areas are sparsely populated and largely by pastoral groups, where customary use of the land was more common. But the areas where most of the population lived, in the Plano Alto and the coastal areas, had been long settled and had, of course, the highest densities. And those areas had been transformed, I think, back in the 1930s, at least before the Second World War, into individual family-held plots. In most of this area, the African population had operated as camponeses or peasant holdings, partly because the Portuguese taxed individual families, and this had or the taxation laws or the poll taxes were introduced in the earlier part of the 20th century, and this had contributed to the breakdown of traditional customary land management under the traditional chief of the Soba. So individual families were obliged to raise funds to pay their taxes, and this was one of the factors that broke down the customary system of land management under a village chief. So the majority of people in Angola had long ago abandoned, to some extent, customary practices of land management. Although, as I said, in the remoter eastern, sparsely populated eastern and southern parts of the country, customary practices were still in place, and that land hadn't fallen under the Portuguese colonial cadastre. Development workshop principally focused on issues around urban land. What had happened during the conflict years was a massive flux of populations out of the Plano Alto and the high-density rural areas of the country to the cities. And populations, displaced populations, tended to occupy land in the peri-urban periphery of the major cities, and increasingly in the coastal areas that were the most secure. Populations from the Central Highlands would migrate to the urban capitals under pressure from the UNITA, or as villages were attacked and people moved to the cities. And then as the war in the 90s moved to the cities, people fled to the coastal areas. So there was a tremendous growth of coastal cities like Luanda, Sumbe, Lobito, Benguela, even Namib in the south. So these cities were growing very, very quickly. And so some of these populations moved back in the 1980s. So some families had been in the had migrated to the city almost a generation before. There were peri-urban families that had thought they'd acquired land tenure in the peri-urban areas. In many cases, they were allocated land by the local administration or the Comissões de Moradores, or residence commissions, or communal authorities or municipal authorities. Other cases, they purchased land from farmers who had land in the green belts around the city, and had documents that proved the transaction or proved what they thought was a legal concession of their land. But the land law, when published in 2004, didn't respect any of these forms of tenure, or these forms of attribution, or assigning land, acquisition of land. The only legal documents that really protected people were titles for surface rights, or concessions legally offered and recorded in the municipal conservatories around the country. We did a study in 2004 in Luanda, and came to the conclusion that roughly only about 10% of the urban population had paper title that could defend people legally in court. We went back to the same area in 2010, and we found that the proportion of population with what could be considered more or less legal titles was about 5 or 6%. Now, what that told us was that virtually no new titles had been issued during those years. In fact, when we spoke with the conservatory, in Luanda, at that time we did the study, they were only regularizing around 4,000 titles a year, which, I mean, this city was growing from maybe 2 million at the end of the war. Well, today there are 7 million people living in Luanda. So what we were seeing was that virtually no new titles were offered, and that we were capturing the same people. So in terms of resolving this problem of land tenure, we were actually losing ground. I mean, the land law didn't actually put in place administrative mechanisms, regulations that actually facilitated the concessions or the offering of concessions. So there was a national evaluation consultation on the effectiveness of the land law back in December 2014, and it was a national consultation organized by the Casa Civil of the President's office, and the consensus that grew out of that was that the land law had actually failed to meet its goal of contributing to a stabilized, or contributing even to the economy of the country. In fact, it had very little impact. The Casa Civil drew from that the instruments to reinforce that land law were not. They felt that one of the conclusions by the President's office was that the law needed to be reinforced with more stringent legal controls that would take people who didn't respect the law to court. But you can't take 90 or 95% of the population who are occupying land illegally to court. I mean, that conclusion was just completely impractical. Rather than learning from the experience of that in fact the land law should be liberalized rather than made more stringent. I mean, that's the recommendations we made to the Casa Civil and the various ministries that were involved with working on the land law has been this, to learn from countries like Brazil and even to some extent Mozambique, where from our point of view in urban areas, programs like the Favela Bairro initiative, where the idea of providing rights to in situ rights to where people are living now, and the whole process of recognition of what people consider are legitimate proofs of occupation or proofs of rights, such as purchase agreements or concessions made by different levels of government. These things we felt needed to be regularized, and power needed to be downloaded to the municipalities and local government, to whose real interest was in, or still is in, regularizing land to strengthen that level of government. And that's what we were talking about today in terms of what we're doing in the Plano Alto in 10 municipalities of working with local administration, giving them tools for building local municipal cadastres and issuing land recognition, occupation, either titles or licenses that give people land tenure. So these are the approaches that we've been arguing for. As I mentioned earlier, eventually, after the consultation in 2002 to 2004, very few of the recommendations that were made by civil society and that were brought to the National Commission were incorporated in the law. There was an article added around customary land tenure, but it was rather vague and has never properly been, bylaws haven't been published to really qualify how customary law can be, or customary occupation can be transformed into a title, what rights, how the process of acquiring customary or community tenure, this still remains vague and unclear, except in the couple of provinces where we're doing the pilot project. As mentioned, in the province of BA, the provincial governor has published a postura, a kind of bylaw that is applicable only in the province, but that permits the issuing of collective titles for community land, through customary leadership. Now there are all sorts of problems related to customary law and land, and inheritance and gender rights, and none of these things have been really clearly articulated, but at least the principle is being tested. In Wombo, we're working with the provincial government and the local municipalities there, also in issuing administrative occupation licenses that give people land tenure or land protection as well, but on the level of the family, rather than collective village rights. I think individual tenure protection is what most people want, but the advantage of collective tenure is that you can provide some security of tenure for large groups of people at the same time. So there are advantages to the two systems, and we're testing both. In terms of the organizations that are still active, we had many, part of the Red de Terre back in 2002, 2004. A number of them were international NGOs who've long since left the country. And some of the national NGOs still engaged are some of the churches through that have been receiving support mainly through the Norwegian cooperation, particularly in Kwanza Sul province. This is one of the areas that you'll find where the remnants of the Red de Terre still exist. And I hope you do find some remnants also in Huila province, but I think there are not many parts of the country where the Red de Terre has, is still very, well, has left local institutions or local networks that are still active. The Red de Terre itself, one of the problems, it's not just of the Red de Terre, but many of the networks set up by civil society and NGOs over the years in Angola, including the Red de Mulher, the Women's Network, Peace Network, the Land Network and others, human rights networks. These networks were either appropriated by individual NGOs or the elected officers of the network have transformed the network into an NGO or into an NGO itself, and now are competing for the limited financing that is available with their members, or the members that had created the network in the beginning. So I think in this period, this last 10 years or so of diminishing assistance to Angola or from international institutions, that there's, the competition for resources has resulted in the dismantling or the weakening of these networks, basically. So the Red de Terra functionally doesn't exist as a network, but the person elected as the chair of the Red de Terra still operates the Red de Terra as an NGO, basically. But there hasn't been a Conselho or an election to nominate other officers of the network for at least 10 years, as far as I know. Organizations like Development Workshop and ADRA are still I think the key local organizations involved with research and advocacy around land issues. Of course, Development Workshop is much more on the urban, peri-urban side, and ADRA has much more of a rural focus, but we work closely together on campaign issues and on advocacy issues, because the laws that are applied, certainly around land tenure, are the same. There's not a law for rural land and a law for urban land. Yeah, we're working, and in principle, our goals and motivation in defending communities and local or the interests of the poor or most vulnerable populations is a common platform that we have with ADRA. Development Workshop has managed to mobilize research funding for our work around land. I mentioned from DFID in years past, but we've been working with some financing from the International Development Research Centre, IDRC, which is Canadian funding. We've worked with Africa Centre for Cities out of the University of Cape Town on a Pan-African research network, where we are the sort of the Angolan contributor to that research network. We've managed to raise some funding through different donors. We're working with USAID on work around gender and land rights. All of this work is on our website, and you can find it through our programs menu and look down on land and settlements, and all of our research is posted there, and current work is regularly updated there. So there you can also go to the forums menu on our website, and under urban forums and housing finance and our weekly debates. There's a lot of material around land, rural and urban land tenure issues. I mentioned our compendium of legislation on land tenure going back to the early 19th century, and we're trying to get as much data, information, research that others have done as well into the public domain. Angola is a country that is under-researched in comparison to most other African countries, most other developing countries. There's a huge amount of historical work, but current work as well that needs to be done. And for us, research is one of the advocacy tools that we think is most effective. We are promoters of the ideas around co-production of information, co-production of research information. Co-production means that we work with communities, local government, and whenever possible, national government on engaging in research, because local and national governments need this information for their planning and their budgeting. Municipalities need it to plan their budgets. So we work very closely with, through our internship program, with a number of, with actually all of the Angolan universities, and normally every year we have about 45 finalist students completing their dissertations that we link up with research and advocacy projects. So we're regularly producing material. The idea of co-production is that it also, because material is co-produced by local government and local communities and academics as well, or professionals. But the process of validation of that information, because it's co-owned from the beginning, becomes much easier than traditionally an academic who may come up with a very interesting piece of research. But to use that for advocacy, there's always a question of validation of information. And by engaging the government from the beginning in collecting information, the validation is implicit to some extent. So we've found that this participatory co-production approach is an effective way of influencing policy as well, public policy, around issues like Latin. So we've been working with trying to influence a revision of land policies in Angola. One side is we would like to see a revision of the land law, a reform of that land law, but not to make it more rigid, but to make it to free it up and to make it more pro-poor. But the other side is working with local municipalities and local government in administrative capacity building at the local level to use land management tools. And we have a partnership with, in this project, with the support from the European Union, with UN Habitat and the Global Land Tools Network, and we're implementing a cadastral process in the Plano Alto called the social tenure domain model. It's a software-based model that collects information about land occupation through. We use tablets. We use actually Samsung kind of 7-inch tablets, they're quite cheap. They're mobile phone chips in them, linked with, so we can download Google Maps and work in real time on land mapping. With a tablet, you can capture the testimony of the neighbors around land claims. You can photograph land documents if the family's ever paid a fine or ever received a concession or permission to occupy that land, or if they've paid a water bill or something like that, that records the address. Mm-hmm. And so these are all evidence that can be accumulated in a online database mm-hmm. to validate people's claims to the land that they're living on. So we're working, as I mentioned, 10 municipalities in the plan a while to get the local municipalities to own that information, record it, put it on their maps, and then issue a map-based document, a license, a recognition of occupation of that land. Mm-hmm. It's not the same as a legal title, but it's the first step towards acquiring a legal title, and it's relatively easy to do, and using kind of ICTs and simple technology. We're training local authorities and to work with communities in capturing that information. So we're interested in working not only in the public policy advocacy, but also practically on the ground in getting these ideas implemented in practice at the community and municipality level. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's interesting for municipalities to actually have a land occupation database and that information mapped, because in the future, when municipalities become autarkiish, or when the decentralization reforms that are promised are put in place, that information will be very useful for municipal authorities to develop a tax base and to, and in the process of issuing land occupation permits, people are quite willing to pay for the fees for having that process done, and it's a line of finance, community-based finance, sustainable financing for local municipalities. In fact, all over the world, municipalities are financed through land value capture, through either taxation on land occupations, or sale of titles, or issuing of building permits on land. This is how municipal levels of government get financed everywhere in the world. And Angola has not made use, I mean, with the fall of oil prices, Angola has to look at alternative ways of raising funding for local services and local government, and this is an obvious one. So we're trying to convince local government that it's in their interest to do a cadastre and to work with communities around regularizing land. And this tool of the STDM model, the social tenure domain model, is an excellent tool for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I just have one last question, and then we can wrap it up. So you mentioned that you work mostly in the urban areas, but I'm more interested in the rural. But since you've been here since 1981, you have a little bit of experience, and you have a different perspective than other people. So I was thinking, the question is thinking about the evolution from since you've been here until today, and particularly pre and post land law that was done in 2004. What activity have you seen, and what local groups or organizations have been the most active during this time period? So when you first arrived, there probably wasn't very much action going on, but since then, and especially after the land law, has it been mostly focused on cooperatives, mostly focused on associations? Has it been fully led by ONG or NGOs, or has there been some sort of national activity also? What do you think?
Well, if one looks at the period up until the first post-war land law, 91, This was a period of the one-party state. In fact, there was probably far more consultation at that time, where party-based institutions like UNACA, the union of the cooperative, the peasants, Camponeses union, and the movement towards cooperatives, probably were further advanced in those years. But because the country was increasingly destabilized by the Civil War, this was a debate amongst agronomists and people in government. I know the Vice Minister at the time, Benjamin Costello, who Tiago just interviewed today, worked very much on that law at the time and on reforms. The work that Fernando Pacheco and Júlio Moraes did on that at that time are a good indicator that there was an awareness and a political, at least in the ruling party, a commitment towards cooperativization and the creation of peasants' associations, etc. But little could be done practically because the countryside was largely destabilized. Who became the defender of those ideas after the 91-92 period was ADRA. And the same people who were working within the party in the 1980s set up ADRA as an NGO to largely defend those ideas. But the policy that was put in place under the first land law, as I said, didn't really respect those, it didn't really promote cooperatives. It recognized the colonial cadastre and allowed people in government and ex-military to acquire the property rights of the concessions that had previously been offered to, or that had been abandoned by the colonial settlers. The approach, no doubt, was seen at that time as a part of a post-war engagement of military. It was a perk for those who had been military leaders, etc. But then the country went back to war in 92 in any case, and the 91 land law really wasn't implemented. Not a few areas that were considered to be in safe areas were transferred to concession holders. But in many cases, as the war heated up in the years following that, many people never even got to visit their concessions because they were in war-torn parts of the country. So we had hoped that the post-2002, 2004, that land reform would have broken down that colonial cadastre, but it didn't. It still kept it in place. So organizations like ADRA are still defenders of those principles. Development Workshop, as I said, has taken, we work with rural communities as well, but most of our advocacy is around urban land issues. Now, of course, in the post-war period, the majority of the country has moved to cities, so these are really very, very important. In 2014, the census showed that 62% of the population lived in cities. At that time, it could be approaching 2/3 of the population today. in the post-war period, people didn't go back to the countryside by and large. The urban migration continued through the last 10, 15 years as well. So but there are not many organizations that left from that period of the Red de Terra and the debates at the end of the war. As I mentioned, there are the land network in Kwanzaa Sul is interesting, and a number of the churches are involved with that, and the Norwegian Church Aid is supporting some of those organizations. It would be worth talking with them. Mm-hmm. ADRA has been very engaged in Wheeler. Should speak with people like Guilherme Santos, who is normally based in Lubango, and a number of the ADRA is very engaged there, but a number of the smaller organizations. The Catholic Church, a person that you should speak with is Padre Pio, who's a strong defender around land rights. So that the case study of the Gambosh and those others are still, there's still many lessons to learn. We did some work the last couple of years around issues of mining and quarrying and appropriation of peasants' land for non-agricultural use. And the interesting thing about mining legislation is that it the mining rights have a priority over land use rights. So where there's a conflict around a use of natural resources for mining, the mining concession has legally a stronger case. It will, if it went to court, the land claim would have secondary respect. I mean, the mining rights are superior rights.
What do you think about the associations and cooperatives and those sort of organizations? Because we have the ONGs, or the NGOs, I'm sorry, but what about more of the bottom-up idea? From the bottom, where would the activity be coming from? I
think in areas where organizations like ADRA are not engaged, mm-hmm. I think you'll find that there are local organizations like Padre Pio's, etc. Mm-hmm. I think the grassroots emergence, I don't think there is much of a spontaneous emergence of cooperatives or associations mm-hmm. that are not promoted by NGOs, basically. Mm-hmm. Certainly worthwhile looking at EDA's, the government's, the Ministry of Agriculture's program for supporting agricultural associations. Mm-hmm. This is not an area that we do a lot of work on, so I think that's worthwhile looking at. Mm-hmm. If the agricultural associations that are supported through the government's programs, the EDA's, around credit and purchasing of input, seed and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The EDA's are probably quite important, but mm-hmm. I think that's, I don't have a great deal of information to mm-hmm. provide you. I think it'll be interesting to see what you mm-hmm. can glean from your research. Mm-hmm. Okay. And certainly the people like Guilherme Santos and your contacts in the south will be able to. They've also worked with the EDA's for mm-hmm. many years, and it's worthwhile looking at the impact of what the official government programs have been able to support. It's worthwhile you looking at, I think, the agricultural credit programs that it's worth touching on that, that have not been very successful, not been successful at all. In fact, Fernando Pacheco has been involved with research on the effectiveness of the government's agricultural credit programs. And you can also find a presentation on our website that Fernando did that gives you some of his conclusions. But I know he believes that these are really the number of loans repaid is tiny, so it can't be seen as a sustainable program. But if there are ways of providing concessions to farmers, okay, but it shouldn't be called credit programs if the credit is not reimbursed or repaid.
Okay. And do you think we could just do one last question so I can get you on tape, just confirming that it was indeed the one and only time that the civil society participated in the land law writing?
Yeah.
So the question B, why do you think that because this was apparently the one and only time, why did they actually ask for the civil society participation?
The invitation in 2002 for civil society to engage in discussion, debate around the land law happened at a time at the end of the war when there was a huge amount of optimism and faith in the future. The government was in the process of, and I think a very interesting process of engaging the defeated side in the Civil War, UNITA, in the process of demobilization and national reconstruction. And there was a period there where I think a lot of creative things were done by government, and in participatory ways in that there was a consensus at the national level around consolidating peace and delivering on the peace dividend to some extent. There were high expectations from rural people and the poor that everybody would benefit from the gaining or the winning of peace. And that produced a very, I think, a creative atmosphere for a couple of years after the end of the war. And for us who are involved also in the peace movement or the peace building movement, I think lessons from other countries showed us that what can be consolidated in that short period after the end of a war, when people are open-minded and prepared to forgive to some extent, because peace was so welcomed to some extent, that compromises and negotiations, it was an atmosphere of the time. And I think that window of opportunity, if you like, closes if it's not used. It's like building social capital. Social capital can be invested and used and grow if it's used. If it's not used, it closes down. And I think that's what happened. I think we had that 2 years window where there was a lot of optimism, and part of the closure of the window was the fact that the government had high expectations. The international community would also arrive and help with a massive investment program, post-war reconstruction. That never happened. That never. The World Bank had actually closed their program before the end of the war and wasn't really fully engaged. Even the World Bank's demobilization program took months and months and months to come on board. So there was a lot of time lost and energy lost and optimism lost in that period between 2002 and 2004. By 2004, the government had begun to be cynical. the international community had not, there was pressure from the World Bank to implement a poverty reduction strategy that the land reform could have fit very nicely into, but the promise that the World Bank and international investors had brought about, well, we will bring the reconstruction investment if you go through these hoops that the government to some extent did. The international assistance never arrived. Angola therefore turned to China for investment. The pressure from the international community and the atmosphere of consolidation, peace building, kind of dissipated after 2004. And I think the fact that we ended up with a land law that didn't meet our expectations, at least civil society's expectations, is a reflection of that.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss the land law with you. I appreciate it.